June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning, the Bug River, Soviet-German border. The artillery opened fire first. 3,000 guns along an 1,800-mile front erupted simultaneously, transforming the pre-dawn darkness into a flickering hell of orange and red. The barrage was so intense that German soldiers positioned kilometers behind the front lines felt the ground shake beneath their boots. Soviet border posts, wooden structures manned by troops who had been assured that war would not come this summer, simply disintegrated. Men died in their bunks, blown apart before consciousness could register what was happening. This was the opening salvo of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Obergefreiter Hans Roth, a 30-year-old reservist from Frankfurt serving with the 299th Infantry Division, had spent the night before the attack staring across peaceful fields towards Soviet territory. He was a veteran of the French campaign, decorated, experienced. He tried to imagine what the following hours would bring. The village huts he could see in the twilight distance would be burning soon. The air would fill with the howling and screeching of shells. The fields and roads would be torn apart by impacts. But imagination could not prepare any man for what actually came. When the barrage began, Roth later wrote that Armageddon had arrived. It was impossible to comprehend one's world in such an inferno. The sound was beyond description. Individual explosions became meaningless, merging into a continuous roar that made thought difficult and communication impossible. The flashes lit up the night like daylight, casting harsh shadows that jumped and flickered with each detonation. Smoke began rolling across the landscape, thick and acrid, choking anyone who breathed deeply. At 4:45 in the morning, the infantry began crossing the border. More than 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 troops from Romania and Finland, advanced into Soviet territory. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, they represented 153 divisions, 80% of the entire German Wehrmacht. Supporting them were 3,000 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 600,000 motor vehicles. The scope was staggering. The ambition was limitless. The objective was the complete destruction of the Soviet Union in a campaign Hitler's planners estimated would last 8 to 10 weeks. The Luftwaffe struck at 4:15 that morning. Waves of German bombers crossed into Soviet airspace and attacked 66 airfields across the Western Soviet Union. The Soviet Air Force, caught completely unprepared, with their aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on open runways, was systematically annihilated. Bombs fell among clusters of fighters and bombers, each detonation triggering secondary explosions as fuel tanks ignited and ammunition cooked off. By the end of the first day, the Luftwaffe had destroyed approximately 1,800 Soviet aircraft. Most had never left the ground. German losses totaled 35 aircraft. It was one of the most lopsided aerial victories in military history, achieved in less than 24 hours. Soviet border guards were equally unprepared. Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Lomov, commanding a frontier post near Grodno, was awakened by explosions at 3:40 in the morning. He ran outside, still pulling on his uniform, and saw the western horizon lit up by artillery flashes. His post came under immediate fire. Within minutes, 3 of his men were dead, their bodies torn apart by shell fragments. Lomov attempted to radio headquarters for instructions. The line was dead, cut by the bombardment. Another border patrol, taking fire from advancing German troops, sent a panicked radio signal asking what they should do. The reply from headquarters was almost comical in its tragic absurdity. "You must be insane, and why is your signal not in code?" Moscow, even as German shells were falling on Soviet positions across an 1,800-mile front, refused to believe that war had actually begun. For Helmut Pabst, a young German infantryman experiencing his first combat, the initial advance became a blur of sensations and violence. His unit moved fast, sometimes flat on the ground as machine gun fire snapped overhead, sometimes running forward through ditches filled with stagnant water, sand, sun, sweat, always changing position. By 10 o'clock that morning, Pabst felt like he had aged years. He had seen his first prisoners, shuffling columns of stunned Soviet soldiers with their hands clasped behind their heads, eyes vacant with shock. He had seen his first dead Russians, sprawled in defensive positions that had been overrun in minutes, their bodies already beginning to swell in the summer heat. The speed of the German advance was extraordinary. By the end of the first day, some panzer units had penetrated 50 miles beyond the Soviet border. At Brest Fortress, the 45th Infantry Division under General Major Fritz Schlieper launched its assault at 4 in the morning. The fortress sat directly on the Bug River, a massive star-shaped fortification built in the 19th century and modernized by the Soviets. German intelligence had studied it extensively, captured it briefly in 1939, and possessed detailed maps and photographs. Based on this intelligence, created a sand table model and wargamed the assault. Their conclusion was confident. The fortress would fall in 8 hours. The German assault began with a 29-minute artillery barrage of devastating intensity. 3 batteries of 210mm mortars, 2 battalions of 150mm Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, and 2 massive 600mm Karl Gerät super heavy mortars poured fire into the fortress. The bombardment turned the courtyard into a cratered moonscape. Buildings collapsed, their walls blown inward by blast waves. Barracks caught fire. Soviet soldiers were killed in their bunks, blown apart or crushed by falling masonry before they understood what was happening. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Kijevatov of the 44th Rifle Regiment was thrown from his bed by the first explosions. The barracks around him were disintegrating. Men were screaming, calling for help, crying out for medics who could not possibly reach them through the bombardment. Kijevatov stumbled outside and saw a scene from hell itself. The fortress grounds were erupting in continuous explosions. Bodies and pieces of bodies lay everywhere. A fire was spreading through the wooden structures. Wounded men crawled across open ground seeking shelter that did not exist. 4 minutes after the bombardment lifted, German assault troops crossed the Bug River in rubber boats under covering fire from machine guns positioned on the western bank. They seized the railroad bridge intact and pushed into the fortress grounds. The plan called for a rapid penetration, overwhelming any resistance before the Soviets could organize a defense. But the plan was already falling apart. Despite the bombardment, despite the shock, despite the casualties, Soviet soldiers were fighting back. Kijevatov rallied approximately 40 men from his regiment and barricaded themselves in a barracks near the Trespol gate. They had rifles, a few machine guns, and limited ammunition. German infantry assaulting their position found themselves taking fire from windows and doorways. The first wave was stopped cold. The second wave took heavy casualties before withdrawing. By the end of the first day, German losses at Brest Fortress totaled approximately 281 men killed. This was not supposed to happen. An 8-hour operation was turning into a siege. Regimental Commissar Yefim Fomin had been planning to travel to Latvia that weekend to bring his family to Brest. Unable to get train tickets on Saturday, he had returned to the fortress and spent the night in his office. When the bombardment began, he survived only because the building he occupied was not hit directly. He emerged into chaos and immediately began organizing a defense. Fomin was a political officer, responsible for ideological indoctrination and morale. Now he found himself commanding combat operations. Soviet defenders established strongpoints in the citadel, the central fortress complex. Every building that still stood became a defensive position. Every pile of rubble became cover for snipers. The Germans expected to find a shattered garrison, ready to surrender. Instead, they found Soviet soldiers who fought with desperate intensity. Buildings had to be cleared, room by room. Every basement held defenders who fired until their ammunition ran out, then tried to fight hand to hand. 2 days later, Roth's unit was fighting through the village of Lokache, east of Brest. House after house had to be cleared with grenades and small arms. Soviet troops had fortified positions in cellars and attics, covering approaches with machine gun fire. German soldiers would kick in a door and immediately take fire at point-blank range. Men died in doorways, shot before they could raise their weapons. Others were killed by grenades dropped from upper floors. The village should have been taken in hours. It took a full day of brutal, close-quarters combat. By June 24th, the third day of the invasion, German forward units were discovering something their intelligence had catastrophically underestimated. The Red Army possessed far more troops, far more tanks, and far more artillery than German planners had anticipated. Units that were supposed to have been destroyed kept appearing from deeper inside Russia. Divisions that should have retreated instead counterattacked. The Soviet military structure was disorganized and poorly led in many sectors due to Stalin's purges of the officer corps, but it was not collapsing. Near Raseiniai in Lithuania, tank commander Oberleutnant Erhard Raus encountered a Soviet heavy tank his crew had never seen before. The KV-1 was a 45-ton monster armed with a 76.2mm gun and protected by armor up to 100mm thick. German 37mm anti-tank guns bounced rounds off it harmlessly. A single KV-1 positioned on a road held up an entire German column, destroying multiple vehicles before it was finally knocked out by concentrated fire from 88mm anti-aircraft guns used in the direct fire role. When Raus's crew examined the knocked out tank, they counted dozens of impact marks where German shells had hit and failed to penetrate. In the south, near the town of Brody, German units encountered another Soviet tank that shocked them. The T-34 medium tank was fast, heavily armored with sloped plating, and mounted a powerful 76.2mm gun. Its wide tracks gave it superior mobility across rough terrain. German tankers, accustomed to technical superiority over every opponent they had faced since 1939, suddenly found themselves outclassed. Their Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks carried 50mm and 75mm guns, respectively, but the T-34's armor could defeat both at combat ranges. Hitler would later claim that if he had known about Russian tank strength in 1941, he would not have attacked. But Soviet advantages in equipment were negated by catastrophic failures in command, communication, and logistics. Tank formations lacked fuel, artillery batteries lacked ammunition, radio communications broke down. Officers who had survived Stalin's purges were inexperienced, promoted rapidly into positions they were not prepared to handle. When German spearheads cut through defensive lines, entire Soviet armies found themselves encircled before they could effectively respond. At Brest Fortress, the fighting continued with grinding intensity. On June 24th, German casualties had climbed to 368 killed, with thousands more wounded. Soviet prisoners numbered between 4,000 and 5,000, but organized resistance had not collapsed. Captain Ivan Zubachev had taken command of defenders in the citadel after senior officers were killed or captured. He organized the remaining troops, established defensive perimeters, and rationed the dwindling supplies of ammunition and water. Water became critical almost immediately. The Germans had cut the fortress's water supply during the initial bombardment. The June heat was brutal, temperatures climbing into the 90s. Wounded men lay in rubble-strewn rooms, dying of thirst as much as from their injuries. Soviet soldiers made desperate attempts to reach the Bug River to fill canteens, but German machine gunners covered every approach. Men were shot down, trying to crawl to the water. Their bodies lay in the open, bloating in the sun. Gefreiter Wilhelm Ritter, serving with the 135th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Division, wrote in a letter home about the fighting at Brest. The Russians, he explained, did not fight like the Poles or the French. They did not know when they were beaten. Soviet soldiers would play dead among corpses, then open fire when German troops passed. Wounded Russians would detonate grenades when medics approached to render aid. Ritter described clearing a basement where Soviet defenders had barricaded themselves. German engineers pumped flamethrower fuel through a ventilation shaft and ignited it. The screaming lasted for minutes. On June 26th, small groups of Soviet defenders attempted a breakout from the fortress. Captain Zubachev and Commissar Fomin led approximately 200 men in an attack against German positions at dawn. They achieved complete surprise, overrunning a German machine gun nest and killing its crew. But German reinforcements responded quickly. Artillery fire fell on the Soviet assault. Machine guns raked the open ground. The breakout attempt collapsed within an hour. Zubachev was wounded and captured. Fomin was recognized as a political commissar and a Jew. He was executed on the spot, shot in the back of the head, and his body thrown into a shell crater. By June 27th, German panzer spearheads from Army Group Center had converged at Minsk, 200 miles inside Soviet territory. Generals Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth commanded the armored groups that had punched through Soviet defenses and linked up behind enemy lines, creating a massive encirclement. Trapped inside the Bialystok-Minsk pocket were the Soviet 3rd, 4th, 10th, and 13th armies. Nearly 420,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement, subjected to constant air attack and artillery bombardment. The German infantry, marching at a brutal pace to catch up with the panzers, were discovering the physical reality of the Eastern Front. The roads were terrible, primitive dirt tracks that turned to muddy quagmires with any rain and churned into choking dust clouds in dry weather. Infantry divisions were expected to march at least 20 miles per day, day after day, carrying full equipment in summer heat. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, their carcasses left to rot beside the roads. Men dropped from heat stroke, feet blistered and bled inside boots, never designed for such distances. The logistics of feeding, supplying, and moving 3 million men across hostile territory with minimal infrastructure strained German capabilities from the start. For Soviet troops trapped in the encirclements, the experience was nightmarish. German tactics emphasized rapid penetration, followed by systematic destruction of surrounded forces. Artillery pounded the pockets continuously. The Luftwaffe flew constant sorties, dropping bombs on any concentration of troops or vehicles. Stuka dive bombers screamed down in near vertical dives, their sirens adding psychological terror to physical destruction. German infantry tightened the noose methodically, compressing the pockets smaller and smaller until organized resistance collapsed into fragmented groups, trying desperately to break out through German lines. Private Dmitry Vasilyev, serving with the 10th Army's 91st Rifle Division, found himself trapped in the Bialystok pocket. His regiment had been advancing westward on June 21st, conducting exercises. When the invasion began, they were ordered to counterattack the German penetrations, but there were no clear front lines, no coherent defensive positions. German tanks appeared from unexpected directions. Luftwaffe bombers struck supply columns. Communication with higher headquarters was lost. By June 24th, Vasilyev's regiment was surrounded along with thousands of other Soviet soldiers. They had ammunition, but no food. They had weapons, but no idea where the main German force was positioned. Officers debated whether to break out or await relief that would never come. Soviet troops fought with a fanaticism that surprised German soldiers who had expected quick surrender after encirclement. Commissars enforced discipline with summary executions of anyone advocating retreat or surrender. Soviet doctrine emphasized counterattack even when surrounded and outgunned. Units that should have capitulated instead launched suicidal charges against German positions. The fighting was savage, personal, and increasingly bitter. A German soldier with the 7th Panzer Division wrote home describing the combat. The Russians, he explained, fought differently than any enemy Germany had faced. They did not understand they were beaten. Entire companies would be wiped out, and survivors would immediately regroup and attack again. Soviet soldiers hid among their own dead, waiting for German troops to pass before opening fire from behind. Wounded Russians, clutching grenades, would wait for medics to approach before detonating them, killing themselves and anyone nearby. The gentleman's rules that had governed warfare in Western Europe were meaningless here. At Brest Fortress, by the end of June, the main organized resistance was collapsing. missing, but individual strongpoints held out. The East Fort, a separate fortification connected to the main citadel, was still defended by approximately 300 Soviet soldiers under Major Pyotr Gavrilov. German attempts to take the fort by infantry assault had failed repeatedly with heavy casualties. On June 29th, the Luftwaffe bombed the East Fort with 250-kilogram bombs, reducing its casemates to rubble. Still, the defenders refused to surrender. General Schlieper reported to his superiors that it was impossible to advance against the East Fort with infantry alone. The highly organized rifle and machine gun fire from deep gun emplacements cut down anyone who approached. German engineers brought up flamethrowers and demolition charges. They systematically destroyed each defensive position, burning out bunkers with liquid fire and collapsing entrances with explosives. Soviet defenders fought until they physically could not continue. When ammunition ran out, they fought with entrenching tools and fists. By July 2nd, organized resistance in Brest Fortress had finally ended. The 45th Infantry Division reported total casualties of 482 killed, including 32 officers and over 1,000 wounded. For a fortress that should have fallen in 8 hours, the cost had been catastrophic. German losses at Brest represented over 5% of all Wehrmacht fatalities on the Eastern Front during the entire first week of war. The division estimated Soviet dead in the fortress exceeded 2,000, with over 7,000 taken prisoner. But even after organized resistance ended, isolated Soviet soldiers continued hiding in the ruins. They sniped at German patrols. They launched nighttime raids to steal food and ammunition. On July 23rd, more than a month after the invasion began, a German cleaning crew came under fire from a casemate near the northern gate. 5 Germans were wounded. When assault troops stormed the position, they captured 1 Soviet senior lieutenant who had been living in the ruins, fighting alone, for 32 days. The cost for the Red Army in that first week was catastrophic across the entire front. The Western Front, the primary Soviet defensive formation facing Army Group Center, effectively ceased to exist. 4 armies comprising 20 divisions were destroyed. Over 400,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 5,000 tanks were lost. Soviet tank units that had begun the campaign with over 1,000 vehicles per mechanized corps were reduced to dozens or none at all. The Soviet Air Force had been gutted, losing operational control of the skies across the entire invasion front. But the Germans, despite their stunning tactical successes, were beginning to realize that something fundamental was wrong with their strategic assumptions. The Red Army was supposed to collapse after losing the border battles. The Soviet state was supposed to crumble once its armies were shattered. Instead, new Soviet formations kept appearing from deeper inside Russia. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, was mobilizing reserve armies from the interior and rushing them westward by rail. Men who should have been working in factories were being conscripted, armed with whatever weapons were available, and sent to the front. German intelligence reported on July 2nd that the Red Army had mobilized at least 360 divisions. German planners before the invasion had estimated the Soviets possessed 200 divisions total. Where were these additional formations coming from? How could the Soviet Union, after losing 500,000 men in the first week, still be fielding massive armies? The comfortable assumptions that had underpinned Operation Barbarossa were revealing themselves as dangerous delusions. German casualties in the first week were relatively light compared to Soviet losses, but they were much higher than expected. Infantry divisions that had crossed the border at full strength were reporting significant casualties. Companies that should have been at 150 men were down to 80 or 90. Battalions were amalgamating platoons to maintain combat effectiveness. The 45th Infantry Division's experience at Brest was being replicated across the front in smaller engagements. What should have been easy victories turned into grinding fights. What should have taken hours took days. The timeline of the campaign, carefully calculated to achieve victory before the onset of winter, was already slipping. The physical conditions were becoming a problem. The weather remained brutally hot, with temperatures regularly exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. The roads were choked with dust that got into everything: food, water, weapons, equipment, lungs. Infantry were exhausted from constant marching and fighting. Boots that had seemed adequate in Poland or France disintegrated on Russian roads. Feet developed blisters that became infected in the unsanitary conditions. Medical services were strained, treating not just combat casualties, but heat exhaustion, dysentery, and various infections. Supplies were becoming problematic. Fuel trucks could not keep pace with advancing panzer units, which had to halt repeatedly to await resupply. Ammunition consumption was far higher than predicted. Every encirclement battle consumed tens of thousands of artillery shells. Infantry expended rifle ammunition at rates that planners had not anticipated. The German logistics system, designed for the shorter distances and better infrastructure of Western Europe, was straining under the vast spaces and primitive roads of Russia. On the night of June 29th, exactly 1 week after the invasion began, Roth sat in a captured Soviet position and wrote in his diary, "The advance had been extraordinary," he acknowledged. Thousands of prisoners had been taken. Entire Soviet formations had been encircled and destroyed. Territory had been gained at unprecedented speed, but the costs were mounting. His division had lost hundreds of men. Every day brought more casualties. Veterans, men who had survived Poland and France, were being killed or wounded. And ahead, stretching endlessly eastward, was more Russian territory, more Soviet soldiers, more fighting. Private Vasilyev, trapped in the Bialystok pocket, attempted to break out on the night of June 30th. His group, approximately 200 men from various shattered units, moved under cover of darkness toward what they believed was a gap in German lines. They were wrong. German machine guns opened fire at close range. Vasilyev saw the man beside him cut in half by bullets. He dove into a ditch and lay motionless as tracers streaked overhead. When the firing stopped, he crawled eastward for hours. By dawn, he was alone, separated from his unit, behind German lines, with no food, no clear idea of direction, and enemy troops all around him. He would spend the next 3 weeks trying to reach Soviet lines, living off raw potatoes stolen from fields, hiding during the day, and moving at night. He would eventually make it back, one of the few who escaped the encirclement. Most did not. By early July, the German advance had penetrated 400 miles into Soviet territory. Army Group Center was approaching Smolensk, halfway to Moscow. Army Group North was pushing toward Leningrad. Army Group South was battling through Ukraine toward Kiev. The map showed dramatic German gains, massive encirclements, stunning victories. Hitler and his generals looked at the maps and saw confirmation of their expectations. The Soviet Union was being destroyed. Victory was inevitable. The campaign would be over before winter. But soldiers at the front were beginning to understand a different reality. They had broken through the border defenses. They had encircled enormous Soviet formations. They had achieved tactical victories that would have ended any previous war Germany had fought, and yet the Red Army kept fighting. New divisions appeared where none should exist. Soviet troops launched counterattacks even when surrounded and cut off. The distances were vast, the roads primitive, the weather brutal, and the enemy refused to acknowledge defeat. Helmut Pabst, who had felt like an old soldier after 10 hours of combat on the first day, had by the end of the first week experienced things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had shot men at close range, seen their faces as bullets struck them. He had watched friends die beside him, calling out for mothers or wives in their final moments. He had marched until his feet bled through his boots, leaving bloody footprints on dusty roads. He had gone days with minimal food and water, his stomach cramping with hunger. He had learned that combat in Russia was fundamentally different from anything the Wehrmacht had encountered before. This was not a war that would be won quickly. The first week of Operation Barbarossa had achieved unprecedented military success by any historical standard. 3 Soviet fronts had been shattered. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners had been taken. The Germans had advanced deeper and faster than any invading army in history. Territory equivalent to France had been conquered in 7 days, and yet something was profoundly wrong. The campaign was supposed to be finishing. Moscow should have been suing for peace. Stalin should have been overthrown by his own generals. The Red Army should have ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Instead, the war felt like it was just beginning. Soviet resistance was stiffening rather than collapsing. New armies appeared to replace destroyed ones. The industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, dismissed by German intelligence as primitive and ineffective, was beginning to mobilize for total war. The tank battles in Lithuania and Ukraine revealed a problem that would haunt German armored forces for the rest of the war. Near the town of Reshenyi on June 24th, a single Soviet K-1 heavy tank had positioned itself at a crossroads and ambushed a German supply column. The tank destroyed 12 trucks, an ammunition carrier, and disabled several lighter German vehicles before withdrawing. When elements of the 6th Panzer Division attempted to destroy it, they discovered their weapons were useless. General Erhard Raus personally observed as German tank crews fired repeatedly at the KV-1 from ranges as close as 20 meters. The shells bounced off harmlessly. 37mm anti-tank guns scored direct hits that left paint scratches on the Soviet tank's armor. 50mm guns from Panzer III tanks achieved penetrations only against the rear engine deck, and even then the damage was insufficient to stop the vehicle. The KV-1 continued engaging German forces for an entire day before concentrated fire from an 88mm anti-aircraft gun finally knocked it out. When German engineers examined the destroyed tank, they counted over 70 impact marks on the hull where German weapons had hit without effect. The T-34 encounters were equally shocking. A German battle report from June 23rd described a T-34 advancing through a defensive line held by 6 anti-tank guns. The guns fired continuously, their shells producing a sound like a drum roll as they impacted the Soviet tank. The T-34 drove through the position like an impregnable prehistoric monster, crushing one of the guns under its tracks before withdrawing. Lieutenant Stups Panzer III scored 5 hits on the T-34 at ranges between 20 and 50 meters using armor-piercing ammunition. None penetrated. German tank commanders were reporting encounters that shattered their confidence in their equipment. A Panzer IV crew near Dubno engaged a T-34 at 400 meters, the maximum effective range of their 75mm gun. They scored 3 hits on the Soviet tank's frontal armor. All 3 rounds bounced off, deflected by the sloped plating. The T-34 returned fire, its 76.2mm gun penetrating the Panzer IV's armor with the first shot. The German tank brewed up immediately, ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that killed the entire crew. Oberst Hermann Balk, commanding a panzer regiment in the southern sector, reported to his superiors that the Soviet tanks were superior to anything Germany possessed. His tank crews were experienced veterans of the Polish and French campaigns. They knew how to engage enemy armor, but the T-34s and KV tanks changed everything. German tactics relied on superior mobility and gunnery to defeat heavier enemy tanks. Against these Soviet designs, neither advantage applied. The T-34 was faster than German medium tanks. Its gun was more powerful. Its armor was better angled and thicker. German tanks that had dominated every battlefield from Warsaw to Paris were suddenly obsolete. But these superior Soviet tanks were being wasted through catastrophic failures in logistics and command. T-34s ran out of fuel and were abandoned by their crews. KV tanks broke down from mechanical failures and could not be recovered. Entire tank battalions lost communication with higher headquarters and wandered aimlessly, searching for enemies to engage. Soviet tank crews had minimal training. Many had fewer than 10 hours of experience operating their vehicles before being sent into combat. Radio discipline was non-existent. Coordination between tanks and infantry was poor or absent. The result was a paradox that would define much of the first year of the war. The Red Army possessed equipment that was in many ways superior to German designs. They had more tanks, more artillery, more manpower than the Wehrmacht. But organizational chaos, poor leadership, inadequate logistics, and Stalin's purges of competent officers meant these advantages were squandered. German units that should have been annihilated by superior Soviet tanks instead destroyed them through better tactics, better coordination, and better leadership. Private Vasilyev's attempt to break out from the Bialystok pocket on June 30th was not unique. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were making similar attempts every night. Small groups would gather after dark, pull whatever ammunition they still possessed, and try to slip through German lines. Some succeeded, most did not. Unteroffizier Karl Fuchs, serving with an infantry company guarding the southern edge of the pocket, spent his nights listening for movement in the darkness. The Soviets would come silently at first, crawling through fields toward German positions. Then someone would step on a branch or disturb a sleeping bird. German machine gunners would open fire, tracers streaking across the darkness, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning. The screaming would start. Men hit and wounded would cry out. Others would shout commands in Russian, trying to organize an assault or retreat. Sometimes the Soviets would charge the German positions, running directly into machine gun fire. Sometimes they would withdraw. Either way, when dawn came, there would be more bodies lying in the fields. Fuchs wrote to his wife, describing the nightly slaughter. He felt no satisfaction in it. These were not soldiers making heroic last stands. These were desperate men trying to escape encirclement, willing to die for even a small chance of reaching their own lines. Fuchs had been a school teacher before the war. He had joined the Wehrmacht out of patriotic duty, believing the propaganda about defending Germany from Bolshevism. Now he was shooting trapped men in the dark and wondering when this would end. The encircled Soviet forces were running out of everything. Food was gone. Soldiers were eating grass, bark, anything they could digest. Water sources were contaminated by corpses. Wounded men lay untreated, their injuries infected, dying slowly over days. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Units were combining the last rounds from multiple weapons to give a few soldiers enough to fight. Medical supplies were non-existent. Morphine had run out in the first 2 days. Surgeons were amputating shattered limbs without anesthesia, holding men down while they screamed through wooden bits clenched between their teeth. Commissar political instructor Nikolai Moskvin, trapped with the 10th Army, spent his time preventing panic rather than organizing defense. Soviet soldiers were deserting into the woods, trying to hide from both Germans and their own officers. Others were discussing surrender, despite knowing that political commissars like Moskvin would be shot immediately if captured. Moskvin executed 3 soldiers for defeatism on June 28th. He executed 4 more on June 29th. He was maintaining discipline through terror because there were no other tools available. On June 30th, his own men shot him in the back during a German artillery barrage. They surrendered the next morning. By the first week of July, the Bialystok-Minsk pocket was collapsing. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered or were captured. German forces marching captured Soviet troops to the rear found themselves managing columns that stretched for miles. The prisoners were in terrible condition. Many were wounded. All were starving. They had no energy to march, shuffling forward slowly, men collapsing from exhaustion every few hundred meters. German guards had not prepared for managing this many prisoners. There were insufficient trucks to transport them, insufficient food to feed them, insufficient medical care to treat the wounded. The prisoners were herded into makeshift camps, empty fields surrounded by barbed wire, with no shelter and minimal provisions. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery killed hundreds. Typhus appeared. Men who had survived the encirclement battle died in captivity from starvation and disease. The Geneva Conventions governing treatment of prisoners of war did not apply on the Eastern Front in any meaningful way. Hitler had explicitly ordered that the war against the Soviet Union was a war of annihilation, not a conventional conflict. Soviet commissars were to be shot on capture. Communist Party members were to be executed. Jewish soldiers were to be handed over to SS Einsatzgruppen for liquidation. Regular Red Army soldiers were to be worked to death or starved. The Wehrmacht, despite its later claims of fighting a clean war, implemented these orders. Einsatzgruppe B, operating behind Army Group Center, reported killing over 7,000 people in the first week of the invasion. Most were Jewish civilians, shot in mass executions and buried in ditches. But the killing also included Soviet POWs, political commissars, and anyone suspected of partisan activity. The Holocaust was beginning simultaneously with the military campaign, the two operations intertwined and mutually reinforcing. German soldiers witnessed these atrocities. Some participated willingly, others watched in silence. A few protested and were transferred or silenced. The majority accepted it as necessary for victory. The propaganda had been effective. Soviet soldiers were not human beings deserving of mercy. They were Bolshevik subhumans to be destroyed. The war in the East was different from the war in the West. Different rules applied. Different morality governed behavior. Gefreiter August Sander, serving with an infantry division in Ukraine, wrote in his diary about watching Einsatzgruppen shoot Jewish families near the town of Lviv on June 30th. He described it clinically. Without emotion, the Jews were marched to a ravine, ordered to undress, and shot in groups. The bodies fell into the ravine. The next group was brought forward. The process continued for hours. Sander did not express horror or sympathy. He noted that the operation was efficiently organized and that the Einsatzgruppen had executed over 1,000 people that day. He mentioned it the way someone might describe a logistical achievement. The brutalization was not one-sided. Soviet NKVD units executed thousands of prisoners held in jails across the Western territories before German forces arrived. Political prisoners, Ukrainian nationalists, Polish officers, and others were shot en masse to prevent them from being liberated. In Lviv, NKVD personnel killed over 4,000 prisoners in the days before the city fell. The bodies were discovered by advancing German troops and used for propaganda purposes, presented as evidence of Jewish Bolshevik barbarism. By the end of the first week, the character of the war was already clear. This would not be a conflict governed by military professionalism or international law. This would be total war, fought without restraint, where civilians and soldiers alike were targets, where surrender meant death, where atrocities were policy rather than exception. The physical toll on German forces was mounting in ways that statistics could not fully capture. Heat exhaustion was endemic. Soldiers were drinking water from streams and wells contaminated by corpses and sewage, contracting dysentery and other intestinal diseases. Feet were developing infections from constant marching in boots that never dried. Minor wounds were becoming infected in the unsanitary conditions. The German medical system, designed for a short campaign, was already overwhelmed. Hauptmann Heinrich Hoppe, a battalion medical officer, described treating over 200 casualties in a single day on June 27th. He had morphine for perhaps 50 men, bandages for even fewer. He was performing amputations with a bayonet because his surgical instruments had been lost when a supply truck hit a mine. Men were dying from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Others were dying from infections that antibiotics could have prevented. The image of German military efficiency was dissolving in the reality of logistical breakdown. And winter was coming, not immediately, not in weeks, but German planners had calculated that the campaign must be finished by October at the latest. Any fighting that extended into November would face the onset of Russian winter, and German forces had no winter equipment, no cold weather uniforms, no antifreeze for vehicles, no winterized lubricants for weapons. The plan required victory before weather became a factor. The plan was already failing. The German soldiers who had crossed the Soviet border with such confidence on June 22nd could not have known that they were beginning a campaign that would consume their army, their nation, and ultimately their world. They could not have foreseen Stalingrad, or Kursk, or the long retreat westward that would end in Berlin's ruins. They could only see what was immediately in front of them, the next village to clear, the next river to cross, the next defensive line to break, the next encirclement to form and reduce. But in that first week, in the burning ruins of Brest Fortress, in the dust-choked roads leading eastward, in the shocked faces of Soviet prisoners and the increasingly exhausted expressions of German victors, the true nature of the Eastern Front was already revealing itself. This would not be France. This would not be Poland. This would be something else entirely. This would be a war of annihilation between two totalitarian systems, fought with industrial-age weapons and primitive brutality, across distances that defied comprehension, between peoples who had been taught to view each other as subhuman. Operation Barbarossa's first week had achieved everything Hitler's planners had predicted. The border armies were destroyed, massive territorial gains were secured, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, German panzers roamed deep into Soviet territory. By every measurable military metric, the campaign was succeeding brilliantly. And it meant nothing. The war was just beginning. The real nightmare lay ahead. 4 years of fighting, 27 million Soviet dead, 5 million German casualties, cities reduced to rubble, villages burned. Millions murdered in genocidal campaigns, partisans hanged from trees, prisoners starved in camps. The Eastern Front would become the graveyard of Hitler's army and the forge of Soviet victory. It would change the course of the 20th century. It would determine the shape of the post-war world. But on June 29, 1941, none of that was clear yet. There was only the heat, the dust, the bodies, the exhaustion, and the realization that the easy war German soldiers had expected was not going to happen. The Red Army was broken, but not destroyed. The Soviet Union was reeling, but not defeated. And somewhere in the vast depths of Russia, beyond the advancing German spearheads, millions more Soviet soldiers were being mobilized, armed, and sent toward the front. The first week was over. The war had barely begun.